So just while the panel's getting on stage, good evening, everyone. My name is Jayashri Wyatt of the Culture Project, and we have an incredible panel for you tonight. And actually, I'd like to really just offer another round of applause for the civilians. That was incredible. And it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion. He is the host of The Majority Report and co-host of Ring of Fire Radio. He appears regularly on MSNBC, CNN, and Current as a political commentator. He has written and directed numerous pilots and films and currently performs recurring voices on Fox's animated series, Bob's Burgers. Please warmly welcome Sam Seder.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I want to introduce your panelists this evening. Patrick Markee is the Senior Policy Analyst and Director of the Advocacy Department at the Coalition for the Homeless. He has authored numerous research studies on affordable housing and homeless policies in New York City, and articles and reviews for The Nation and the New York Times Book Review. Welcome, Patrick. Taylor Jo Isenberg serves as the National Director of the Roosevelt Institute Campus Network, a student policy organization with over 10,000 members. She previously worked for the Partnership for a Secure America as a Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow, Carolina for Kibera, and the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. And to my right, Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and columnist for Truthdig, specializing in American and Middle Eastern politics. He was foreign correspondent for the New York Times for 15 years. Join him in the lobby after this conversation, where he'll be signing copies of his new book that he wrote with graphic artist and journalist Joe Sacco, entitled Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. That'll be right out here in the lobby. Chris Hedges. And Robert Johnson is Executive Director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and Director of the Global Finance Project at the Roosevelt Institute. He regularly contributes to New Deal 2.0 with his Financier column, and serves on the United Nations Commission of Experts on Finance and International Monetary Reform. Okay, so what we'll be doing is we'll do a series of questions, and then we'll be asking for questions from you, and you should hopefully have little cards and writing utensils, and those questions will be collected in the next round of our panel. But Patrick, I want to start with you. You wrote an article entitled, for The Nation magazine, entitled The Unfathomable Cuts in Housing Aid. I want to start sort of on a fairly granular level here. Give us a picture of what's happening in the wake, in particular, of the mortgage crisis in this country in terms of what you're noticing in terms of housing and homelessness.
Well, it should come as no surprise to anybody that since the economic crisis began in 2008, we've seen a dramatic increase in homelessness in the United States. Even before the economic crisis, there was an estimated more than 3.5 million people who experienced homelessness each year in this country, with nearly 1.5 million of them being children. Here in New York City, for instance, we have 44,000 people bedding down in our shelter system each night, including 18,000 children. And over the course of a year, more than 110,000 different individuals cycle through our emergency shelter system. We're talking about a problem that, for many people when they first encountered it in the 80s, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, seemed like a sort of shocking new feature of the urban landscape, something you couldn't imagine happening in a country as wealthy as ours. 30 years later, it's now an institutionalized part of American life, and we have, a generation or two of Americans who've grown up in a country where mass homelessness is a common feature of American life, where the fact that you've got thousands and thousands of children bedding down in shelters each night or sleeping in cars or sleeping doubled up in other poor families' apartments is just a sort of fact of life. I think it was interesting when listening to the talk about Occupy, and I do think one of the interesting things about the Occupy movement was that it amplified a discourse that we had been seeing about income inequality and all these things that had emerged over the same period of time, all the same things that happened in the dramatic structural economic changes that we saw since the 70s and since the Reagan era, in some ways are typified by homelessness. Adding into that, of course, the foreclosure crisis and its kind of intimate sort of relationship with that financial crisis that triggered the lesser depression that we're still living now, and you see, sort of a wave of displacement that's affected, just untold people in this country, and it still remains sadly sort of invisible. When we talk about homelessness, I still think there's that stereotype that most people have that you're talking about sort of older or middle-aged men holding a paper cup, panhandling on the subway or on the street corner, when in fact the majority of homeless people in New York City now, 3 out of 4 of them are families with kids. And that's more and more the real picture of who experiences homelessness in this country. African American children, Latino children, their families, that's who really is homeless.
And Taylor, give me a sense, you work obviously with student activists. To what extent are students and young people I guess suffering under obviously massive student debt and by the systemic problems that may have arisen out of the crisis or maybe had existed then, and just give me a sense of what you're hearing from the people that you work with.
Yeah, so to give you a sense of who that audience is, we are a campus-based organization. So our 100 chapters are on different campuses across the country, both community colleges, four-year institutions, Ivies, non-traditional students across the board. I think most people have heard that this generation is the first one that's going to be worse off than its parents, which is huge in the land of opportunity and says a lot about where we are as a country. The average person coming out of college has over $12,500 in debt, credit card debt, over $25,000 in student loans. The student loan bubble is, an aggregate, is going to be over $1 trillion. It is the next big bubble that we are facing as a country and dramatically affecting the opportunities of this generation. And not only do they have all this debt, over 50% of young people are unemployed or underemployed, where they have a 4-year degree and are in a position or a job that's minimum wage, that doesn't actually need the education they spent 4 years investing in. So these are issues that are dramatically affecting young people both in the immediacy right now and then also the long term. This generation, as the largest generation in this country, will be 1/3 of the voting electorate by 2020. So it's a powerful voice. And the decisions that we're making today will dramatically affect the future that we will inherit. And so I think the important thing to mention is that these voices are being represented, these issues are being talked about, because how these young people's issues are addressed is going to dramatically affect the future and direction of the country.
And Rob, Patrick sort of touched on this a little bit, but to what extent did the crisis in 2008, to what extent did it wreck the economy or simply put the sort of a systemic problem, a structural problem in relief? So the Great Recession that we're suffering now, is this simply a function of that crisis, or is it a culmination and the crisis was either the culmination or simply made us sort of brought it home a little quicker?
It certainly was an unmasking of a great deal of things that were unsavory in the economy. We had seen the migration within, say, the corporate sector of fewer and fewer people making more money and becoming financially motivated, playing games with stock buybacks and what have you, rather than playing what you might call R&D and other things to make the corporation productive. We saw, unmasked by the crisis, which created acute violence. A lot of people were living with access to consumer credit. Small businesses were using credit cards for their working capital. One of the most egregious things that happened was that banks were allowed on your existing balances to jack your interest rate up from, say, 6.5% or 7% to 31%. Now, if you came to me and said, do you want a 31% loan when essentially there's no inflation? I'd say, are you out of your mind? You could, but I could walk away from those bad terms. They took lots of people and businesses and retroactively essentially threw them into a downward spiral. And what I think, we can go on and on about all the things that were unmasked, the non-supervision, non-regulation of Wall Street. But what was really unmasked that's very hard for the American people to digest is the disintegration of trust. The mythologies of unfettered free markets were shown to be untrue, but the bailouts, the bonuses, allowing usurious interest rates, not taking things out from the government-protected umbrella like derivative securities and proprietary trading, allowed the casino to continue so they could have the same problem again. The Dodd-Frank bill didn't really address any of these things. And finally, kind of like to sort of kick you when you're down, everybody's got these mortgage overhangs. You probably all read about Stockton, California and San Bernardino in the last few days. These places are underwater and we're not doing anything about it. Why is that? Because the large banks have home equity lines of credit and second mortgages that they would have to write down to zero if you reschedule the first mortgage. The situation is still very fragile. They don't want to admit how fragile they are, but probably in a little more pernicious light, the big bankers want to pretend they have earnings so they can have a real bonus pool and suck more money out of these institutions rather than fortifying the institutions and acknowledging reality and allowing these communities to move on and forward. But the thing that we're left with is this legacy that we have no capacity to trust in government. So people don't trust experts. If you saw Inside Job, you understand why. People do not trust the private markets, and they don't trust government. In 1997, Bob Dylan wrote a song in his record Time Out of Mind called It's Not Dark Yet, but It's Getting There. Well, now it's dark.
And so I want to come back, obviously, to some of that and talk also about sort of that issue of accountability. And but Chris, first let me come to you. You have a new book out, like I had mentioned, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which again you'll be signing out in the lobby. In it, you describe what you call sacrifice zones. Tell us a little bit about sacrifice zones, and to the extent, again, in that almost a similar question that I asked Rob, to the extent that they were there and the factors that were creating these zones were heightened or simply unmasked by the financial crisis.
Well, these are areas of the country that have been sacrificed so the rest of the country could engage in a level of consumption that were denied to people within these zones. The book is something I did with the graphic illustrator Joe Sacco, and partly because one of the goals of the book was to make these people and these sacrifice zones visible because the wider society has rendered them invisible. But we begin in Pine Ridge, where the whole sort of demented project of unlimited exploitation and subjugation began against native peoples, driven by the railroad magnates, the gold speculators, the timber merchants, and of course backed by the U.S. military. We were different from Europe in that we colonized ourselves, and once we finished with westward expansion, we turned on the Philippines and Cuba and everywhere else, including, of course, today, Iraq and Afghanistan. It is about uncovering an ethic where you disempower people within these zones and they are made to prostrate themselves before the dictates of the marketplace. This ideology that we have accepted prima facie, within the wider culture, that somehow the dictates of the marketplace, that human behavior should be made to subjugate itself before the dictates of the marketplace, which is, first of all, a utopian vision. And I use the word utopia the way Thomas More meant it to be used. Utopia literally means no place. It doesn't exist. There's nothing in 3,000 years of economic history to justify the absurdity that human societies should conform to the dictates of the marketplace. We were in Camden, New Jersey. We went right to the bottom because we wanted to show what these unfettered, unregulated, unimpeded forces of corporate capitalism do to communities, do to the environment. We were in southern West Virginia, due to human beings, due to community. Because now that all of those impediments have been lifted, now that we have undergone, as John Ralston Saul says, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over, they've won, they will harvest what's left. And they are harvesting what's left. They're harvesting, again, as Rob touched on, their own structures for personal enrichment. They're harvesting the country. Anytime you have hedge fund managers go into the inner city and talk about education, it's not because they want poor people to learn how to read and write. It's because the federal government spends about $600 billion on education, and they want it. And they're going to get it, just like they're going to get everything else. And I think that the goal of this book was to begin to uncover or unmask the structures of power, corporate power, and how there is nothing now within the formal systems of governance to impede this power. Essentially, we have unleashed corporate systems that commodify everything. Human beings are commodities. The natural world is a commodity that it will exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. In theological terms, and I come out of seminary, these are systems of death. And we have very, very little time left. Just in terms of climate change, you may have seen the infrared maps of Greenland that just came out yesterday. It's utterly horrifying. And the fossil fuel industry, when you understand the nature of unfettered or unregulated capitalism, will literally kill the ecosystem on which we depend for life for quarterly profit. They know no limits. There is no capacity within the engine of corporate capitalism itself to place limits. And because we have essentially allowed through systems, the political process, to surrender our power to these corporations, because the judiciary is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state, because systems of information have been corporatized. Roughly a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, control almost everything Americans see or listen to or watch. We've been rendered deaf, dumb, and blind. The real dialogue, which of course Occupy captured, is shut out from national discourse. And instead we're debating, we talk about Ann Romney's horse or Newt Gingrich's moon colonies or whether Barack Obama's a socialist. It's out of an Alfred Jarry play. And it's terrifying. And I'll just close by saying that for me, the power of the Occupy movement was that it, number one, understood where power was, which is Wall Street, and secondly, it understood that the only mechanism we have left by which we can save ourselves are acts of civil disobedience.
I want to say good night, everybody. Well, Rob, so let me put it to you, and then I want to come to you guys as well and jump in here, because do you feel, and do you guys feel who are working in advocacy, do you feel that the corporate coup d'etat is we are on the other side of that, and there is no other coup d'etat to take place, at least through reform, as it were. Are we on the other side of that? And I mean, obviously that's one of the reasons why there's no accountability on some level. Is there no accountability to be had?
I think we'll call it the oligarchy now, is audacious. they don't really care if they're legitimate. There was a time, you know, I always hear Jürgen Habermas was paraphrased by saying, legitimate if you can, coerce if you have to, and accommodate if you must. And I think we've gone past, I almost started, this was really eerie because we didn't compare notes, I almost started my discussion about John Ralston Saul's book, The Unconscious Civilization. And I think we've gone beyond, I'm grateful, we have gone beyond the unconscious civilization. A lot of people don't buy the package anymore that's emanating from those corporations you talked about. But there is a sort of, okay guys, you're mad. How you going to stop me mentality at the top. Now I'm going to say that fight has to happen, but there's also, you know, they always talk about Marx and capitalism, capitalists versus labor. A lot of the interesting fissures in a system are intra-capitalist conflict. And right now, I guess the way I'd put it in a metaphor is it feels like there are an awful lot of the elite that know this system is not wholesome. And they're all standing on the deck of the Titanic looking in each other's eyes. And they're asking a question with their eyes. Are we going to help this navigator? Are we going to help this captain get off the ice? Are we going to get the food and the jewels from the safe and put them in our lifeboat? And my sense is that most of them are trying to get stuff into their lifeboat. And that system isn't going to cohere. And in that dysfunction, there is opportunity.
Yeah. And I think Chris Hedges talks about the fractal inequality, and that's in his Twilight of the Elites, and that's sort of some of the I guess are we simply, Taylor, are we simply waiting for some of those people on the deck to decide?
The millennials.
Well, yes, I mean, are students, do they have this level of consciousness? I mean, do they realize there's something fundamentally different than perhaps when their parents were students?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think across the board, well, first of all, I just want to say that I'm extremely humbled and slightly intimidated by the fact that I'm the only person on the stage who's not cool enough to have my own Wikipedia page. But anyway, yeah, no, I think it's huge. I think when you look at the numbers, there's all kinds of research. People are fascinated with millennials, how they articulate and exercise their political beliefs, particularly after 2008, where you saw this mass mobilization. This generation by far is significantly more progressive than the ones before it. That's both in the numbers, it's very much so on social issues and to a lesser degree on economic issues and domestic issues. I think that what you saw with Occupy was that awareness. I think that the numbers, over 70% of millennials identify with the values that Occupy espoused. I think it's an interesting question of whether they believed in the tactics and also followed the tactics in full. I think it goes back to the fact that Occupy overall was actually a little bit of an older cohort than not just millennials. So I think that the recognition is there. I mean, they are angry at Wall Street. They are angry at government. There's this really we see it among our network. Students aren't interested in just talking about how we need to tweak this policy to make it better. They're talking about how can we change the system to make sure the policies that we really care about can get us to the kind of the future that we want to inherit. So the awareness is there. I think there's a little bit of confusion about how we get there. I think that's the piece that millennials are action-oriented, and I think that when they espouse the values of Occupy, I think the next step that they're trying to see is like, okay, how do we actualize this? How do we make this happen? And that is a huge question. But I think that the awareness absolutely among this generation that is going to drive this process over the long term is there. It's the question of whether we can maintain that.
Patrick, are you finding amongst the homeless, I mean, we talk about homeless or not, that sort of the stereotypical middle-aged man, but families, is there time, I mean, just in capacity for people who are sort of are a daily struggle to survive? Is there time and capacity to take these perspectives and to act upon them?
I mean, yes. I mean, you know, it's different for different folks depending on their kind of the level of crisis that they're in. I mean, I guess I would say it's interesting. A colleague of mine who talks about the other 1%. I mean, if we have 3.5 million Americans who experience homelessness each year, that's the 1% whose voices, you know, need to be a part of that dialogue. And we saw lots of homeless and formerly homeless folks who are participating actively down at Liberty Plaza, around the country and other parts of the Occupy movements and other occupations. A colleague of mine in DC talked movingly about a homeless vet who stood up at one of the Occupy kind of actions there and talked movingly about how he didn't want it just to be about homeless veterans, which is what the Obama administration is sort of focusing on now. He wanted every homeless person to follow along, to be brought along. But it's interesting, I'm thinking about what Chris said too about these sort of zones of sacrifice. I mean, I think what we've seen in homelessness, this mass homelessness of the last 30 years, which is a fairly unique phenomenon in American history, if you think about it. I mean, the last period of mass homelessness that we had in the United States history was during the Great Depression, and look what came out of that. Not only the New Deal, but public housing and all of the housing reform movements and all the activism that came out of that. What we've seen in these last 30 years are people who've been sacrificed, a whole class of surplus labor, of kind of marginalized poor people who have been literally shunted to the side and institutionalized in the real sense of the word of we're putting folks in shelters, and then of course there's the institutionalization of jails and prisons, and we're taking that kind of segment of the population that's been written off by corporate capital and saying we're moving them to the margins and just putting them aside. So it's not just communities. I mean, we have zones of sacrifice right here in New York City. We have whole neighborhoods and and thousands of people every night who are sacrificed to that sort of corporate movement.
Chris, when you hear Taylor talk about the millennials and they're socially progressive, I mean, is this enough? I mean, are we at the point now where there's such systemic corruption and lack of accountability that we're beyond the efficacy of advocating for, in sort of like the classical political sphere for policies? I mean, are we just sort of, I guess, nibbling at the edges here?
Well, I mean, first let's address the issue of social issues, which Bloomberg is basically okay on. And yet he is a creation of Wall Street and an enemy of the Occupy movement. So I think part of the problem is that too many people within the liberal class or on the left focus too much of their energy into boutique activism, inclusiveness, diversity, all of which I support, of course, but they forgot about the primacy of justice. And while they forgot about the primacy of justice, the corporate state was making war against the working class and has destroyed the working class in this country. There's been a Weimarization of the American working class, and now we are seeing an assault on the middle class as we reconfigure the country and the global economy into a form of neo-feudalism, a world that replicates the power structure of George Orwell's 1984, where you have an inner party of 3 to 4%, an outer party of about 12 to 14%. These are corporate managers, public relations, and then the rest of us become proles, hanging on by our fingertips. And I think this is, for me, one of the great failures of the liberal class, and I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which is over 200 pages looking at this, and it coughed up, for me, these extremely repugnant figures like Bill Clinton, who spoke in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism while assiduously carrying out the dictates of corporate power. It was under the Clinton administration that we saw welfare destroyed. And remember that 70% of the recipients of welfare were children. It was under Clinton that we passed NAFTA, which was the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it extremely difficult to organize. And serious structural analysis of power and how it works is utterly absent from the mainstream. And I feel it every time. I just came back from France. I had a book published in France. And, I get Le Monde, I'm on Radio France, I'm on, Entendu, I go to Canada, it's the CBC. Here, that kind of analysis which Saul makes, and the Canadians are more open to it, of course, Naomi Klein does it, Adbusters does it, Marshall McLuhan did it. That's just utterly wiped out from within the discussion. And I think that at this point, especially after Citizens United, which for me was the death knell of America, at that point it was over for me. I mean, American democracy was extremely anemic. But there's no way to compete. And the perfect sort of case study of this is Wisconsin, where they could have gone one of two ways. They could have gone towards a general strike. Sadly, they got pushed by the AFL-CIO and the Democratic Party back into a recall. And we can't fight anymore on those grounds. They should have gone for the general strike. I'll just close by saying that all the correctives to American democracy came through movements that never achieved formal positions of power. Whether it was the Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists that fought for women's rights, the labor movement, or the civil rights movement. And yet you could argue, at least until he was assassinated in April of 1968, that the most powerful political figure in the country was Martin Luther King, because when he went to Selma, 50,000 people went with him. And I think for me, the problem of the left is that we forgot it's not our job to take power. Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies writes that the question, how do you get good people to rule, is the wrong question. Most people attracted to power, Popper says, are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do you get the people in power to be frightened of you? I lived in France. Sarkozy was a cretin, but he was terrified of the unions and the student unions. I mean, I told my son, who just graduated from Colgate, if you went to France and told French students that they had to pay $52,000 a year to go to college, they'd shut the damn country down. There's a wonderful scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where it's 1971, you know, and Nixon was the last liberal president we had. Not because he was a liberal, but because he was scared of movements. And he and Henry are standing by the window of the White House, and they've got thousands of anti-war demonstrators, and Nixon's terrified, and he's surrounded the entire White House end to end with empty buses, and he looks out the window and he says, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where we want people in power to be.